Well, hello. We're in Matthew 20 today as we continue along in our journey through the book of Matthew. Can you believe that means we've been studying the book of Matthew for 20 weeks? So I hope you're hanging in
Yeah.
there, that we've had a lot of fun getting to make these as well. Something we want to make sure we talk about as we enter into this chapter is that often we look at these chapters so individually, and that's what these videos are doing, but that we also want to be reminded that those chapter markers were added in later. Do you even know when? I don't know when those were added.
Yeah. The Old Testament got some chapters pretty early on in its history. The whole business of chapters and verses really doesn't fully develop till the Middle Ages,
Okay.
so pretty late.
Okay.
So early Christians had Bibles without chapter and verse divisions. It's amazing that they could find anything, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, I know. The references are helpful to us, but we want to
Yeah.
remember that sometimes they kind of interrupt trains of thought. You know, it's not like Jesus was teaching chapter 20 and went on. And that's especially stands out in this one. As we look back at chapter 19, it closes, the last verse of chapter 19 says, "But many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first." And that's just an important sentence that we want to keep in mind as we enter into chapter 20, because it frames the next section that we're going to read together. So we're now in Matthew 20. We're going to start off with a parable in verses 1 through 16. And this is sort of a parable of the workers in the vineyard. So tell us a little bit here about the background and what we see in this parable.
Well, yeah, before I do, though,
Okay.
tell folks where we're headed, because you were making a really good point. The climax of this teaching
That's true. It
is
ends
what?
with the same, are you talking about verse 16?
Yeah,
Or, okay,
yeah.
that's true. That's a good point.
Yeah.
That we see in verse 16 we're still in chapter 20. It says, "The last will be first and the first will be last." So we see 19:30 talks about that, and 20 verse 16 has almost the same framework right there. So it
Yeah.
really is this beautiful, hey, this is the thing you're supposed to take away from this parable. Is that what you wanted?
Yeah, that is so helpful. And I love your word frame. We've got this, it's a parable, which kind of stands on its own, but the frame is very, very important. And the frame is this teaching. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. So there's no doubt about what point Jesus was trying to make with this parable. Now, you wanted us to get started talking
Yes,
about
yeah,
the
tell
parable.
us about this
Yeah.
section.
Interestingly enough, we're not told in what specific situation he told this parable or to whom he was addressing it, the way we do in many other parables of Jesus. It's just missing here completely. So my guess is that this is a parable that was directed not to Jesus' enemies, not to the Pharisees, not to the crowds, but especially to Jesus' closest followers for reasons that are going to become obvious. So we'll come back to that. So this one is pretty straightforward. There's a landowner who, and landowner in those days meant agricultural land, and to make a profit, he needs to hire a bunch of farm workers. Some people had their regular workers, farm workers who lived on the property, but there were hundreds of day laborers around who could be hired then during seasonally, to do certain kinds of jobs that were time sensitive and needed to be done. So I think the parable's talking about those kinds of day laborers. And what we need to notice in the story, folks can read it and see that Jesus started hiring people early in the morning. According to verse 1, early in the morning is the phrase. Then he realized, the job's not going to get done. He hired some more at 9 o'clock in the morning. That's in verse 3. Verse 5 says he hired more at noon, and then about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then before things wrapped up, about 5 o'clock, they had one more push. So he keeps hiring people through the day. The point, though, of the parable is that he paid them all the same. Mm-hmm. And a denarius is the term that's used here. That was a Roman coin.
Okay.
Romans used denarii, Greeks used drachmas, Jews used shekels.
Okay.
So we can tell the context in each of these. So, and the people who got bent out of shape were the day laborers who had been hired and promised a day's wage for a day's work, starting very early in the morning. They're a little upset, to say the least, that the people who worked only about an hour or so, who were hired at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, got the same denarius. And they really complain about that, starting in verse 11. Hey, these guys only worked for 1 hour. You gave them equal to pay to us. We're the ones that worked out in the scorching sun. So they really complain. And the answer to the homeowner, of the landowner, is, look, I gave you what I promised you. Why are you jealous because I was generous? What a question. That comes right at the end of verse 15.
Yes, yeah. That even hearing that right now, I think of when have there been times like that where I've been jealous because someone was generous. That's a hard question to grapple with. Yeah.
Now, I don't think the teaching here is economic. It could be applied that way, I suppose, but I think Jesus is really talking to disciples here, and he's talking more about his attention to certain people, maybe who have just recently started following him. You know, Jesus has finally worked his way from Galilee down to Judea now, and these Galilean followers have been with him for 2.5, 3 years. Now he's down in Judea, making brand new disciples and giving them attention. And so I think the people who really needed to hear this parable were the long-time close followers of Jesus, like Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and people like them who say, wow, why are you spending time teaching these people? We're the ones who've really been devoted to you for 3 years. I'll have to tell you a story. When I read about the death of John Wayne, the famous actor, I learned that he made a deathbed confession of faith in Jesus, deathbed conversion, and I caught myself being irritated with that situation. Isn't
that's funny? Yeah.
Isn't that bizarre and terrible?
that you didn't bring out a spirit of celebration.
I know. I should have been so grateful that finally, after a life sometimes more devoted to himself than to God, he finally repented and came to God. And the thought that crossed my mind was, boy, man, I've been trying to follow God my whole life and obey God's will and everything. And so here he lives however he wants and then gets all the bad. You see? So this is not far-fetched.
Yeah,
actually.
we get caught in this all the time, very much. Yeah.
So, back to your introductory point about Jesus teaching the last shall be first and the first shall be last. He's talking really about God's grace here, isn't it? Not just money matters, but how gracious God is. And don't you love that question? Why are you jealous if I'm gracious and generous with my grace and mercy and forgiveness?
Yeah, we should be glad that we worship a generous God.
Yeah.
I came across something in one of the Bible studies on this chapter that said, justice was served, but mercy was added. And I just thought that was so beautiful. If they were given what they were promised, it's not like the workers in the beginning were, they were given all the money that they had been promised by this landowner. And they're just annoyed that mercy was being shown. And how much do we act like that? Frustrated that God's grace is on display, that mercy is being shown to one another. And instead, we should be celebrating that. And it should inspire us to be more like that instead. So yeah, this is a hard teaching for anyone, I would think.
It reminds me a little bit of that story that we talked about in the last chapter of the rich young man. What more do I need to do to get eternal life. That was his goal. But in Jesus' mind, the goal was following Jesus. What more is there than a life well lived in following Jesus? We don't need to keep looking for more perks. Or
It's not a
something like that.
contest. We're trying to win the prize. We already have the prize. That's great.
So Jesus wants us to be joyous, not jealous.
I like that. And remember that framework again of the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And
Good.
that's something to celebrate. So we go ahead on to verses 17 through 19. And it's a quicker section, but we do want to make sure we notice it. First, it talks about Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. So it reminds us once again of where this story is headed. We see these predictions kind of peppered in there more and more at the end. And that's just such a good thing for us to pay attention to. It's not meant to be random, I don't think, but it's more to show as he's teaching this, they're going to Jerusalem. He's going to the cross. That's where he's headed. Is that what it says to you when we're reminded?
Yeah, I think so. As Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem, that's actually a statement in Luke, not in Matthew, but Jesus then began periodically reminding them where he was headed, and if they were following him, where they were headed too. So in Matthew, we have 3 of these predictions about what's going to happen to him in Jerusalem. In each one, if you put them all together, we get the following facts. He's going to Jerusalem. He's going to be betrayed. He's going to suffer. He's going to be killed, and he will rise from the dead. So you put all 3 together, those are the facts we learn. As Jesus tells these predictions, one after the other, he gets more and more detailed. The closer they get to the actual events, the more detailed he is. So for instance, in the earlier predictions, when it says he's going to suffer, it says he's going to suffer. But in this one, it says he's going to be mocked and flogged. Well, that's way more detailed, isn't it? In the earlier predictions, it says he's going to be killed. In this one, it specifies crucified.
So that's the first time that they hear that, and that's such a terrible way to be killed as well.
Yeah. But all 3 predictions end with raised on the 3rd day. So even though they were kind of tempted to zero in on the what, you're going to be killed, Jesus, I think, was mainly focused on the ultimate result of resurrection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really
He
cool.
does mention the groups that are going to cause his suffering and ultimately death. In verse 18, he mentions chief priests and scribes. So those are the Jewish religious leaders, the ones who were in control of the temple, that's the priests, and the ones who kind of ran the show in synagogues, those are the teachers of the law, the scribes. And they're the ones who were going to condemn Jesus to death, say he needs to be killed, even though they didn't have the power to do it. And then verse 19, Jesus says they're going to hand the Son of Man over to the Gentiles, and they're the ones that will ultimately crucify him. So Jesus saw very clearly that opposition to him was going to come from both Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders,
Okay.
the
It's all them
Gentiles.
together. Okay.
Yep. So Jesus was pretty clear about that, and he's trying to clarify that in the minds of his followers.
Okay. And it's interesting, we have this prediction again where he says how he's going to be betrayed. And they'll kill him, that he'll be mocked and flogged, and he'll on the 3rd day he'll be raised. But all of this kind of reminds you of how lowly and humiliating that whole experience is. And then we go on to verses 20 through 28. And that contrast is just so stark that Jesus is saying he'll be crucified, this humiliating experience. And it says that the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him with her sons, and that she has a question for him. And she goes on to ask about what her sons can kind of get out of this. I don't know if that's too harsh of a way to frame it, but tell us more. Yeah, what do you see in this story as we walk through what happens here?
Well, this request is kind of ironic, considering what Jesus was just talking about, folks saying, I'm going to die. And then this woman comes to Jesus and as if she's completely bracketed out his upcoming death here in a couple of weeks. And she's all focused in on when you come into your glorious kingdom and are ruling and have cast out the foreign enemies. Can my sons have prime places in your cabinet, in your government?
Yeah, the
you
top
know?
two positions.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
top two positions. It's sadly ironic in the light of the fact that he just has prophesied his death. I don't know what she thinks his kingdom is going to be, but I don't think she gets it. This woman is the mother of James and John, the wife of their father Zebedee, and her name may have been Salome. There is a woman named Salome who's very involved in the ministry of Jesus, very close to Mary and Mary Magdalene. It's a little hard to be 100% sure that that's who this is, but that's a possibility anyway. She comes very respectfully, if a little cluelessly. She kneels before Jesus, according to verse 20, and then asks him for a favor. I like the way Jesus frequently asks people to be very specific about what they want him to do for them. We see that in this story, because Jesus responds, says, okay, favor, huh?
Yeah.
So what is it exactly you want me to do? And we're going to see this in the next story, aren't we?
Yeah, he makes them articulate it once again in the upcoming story.
So we'll be looking for that. First of all, Jesus kind of shakes his head in verse 22 and says, you know what? You really don't know what you're asking, because my kingdom, the way I'm entering my kingdom, is by way of a cross. So do you really, is that what you're asking for your sons? That they follow me to crosses? Yeah. He says, you really don't know what you're asking. And then he asks a question, are you able to drink the cup I am about to drink? They said, yes, we are able. He says, you will indeed drink my cup. Now, real quickly, I think we need to chat about
what that means.
Drink my cup.
As I was asking you before, we know a little bit about what happens to James and John in the end. So James ends up being martyred, is that right? And then John, tell us about where he ends up.
Best we can tell, John eventually moved to the big city of Ephesus in western Turkey and had a long, wonderful ministry there. He did suffer great persecution, including exile to a prison island off the coast of western Turkey. But so far as we can tell, died a natural death and was not executed by the government, or we might say martyred, the way his brother was.
His brother was, yeah. So when you see that, you will indeed drink my cup, what does that cup mean?
Yeah, I always assumed it meant pure and simply martyrdom. Drink my cup, face my cross, be killed for your faith, the way I'm about to be killed. I think, though, Jesus must have meant that a little more broadly, precisely for the point you just brought up, which was that John that John wasn't martyred. So maybe we should think of it a little more broadly here. So to drink the cup of Jesus means to completely yield yourself to the sovereignty of God in your life and do whatever you can for the sake of the kingdom, for the sake of the gospel. In James's case, it ended in martyrdom. In John's case, it ended in a long life of service with some suffering. So maybe drink that cup means prepare to sacrifice self for service of God.
Whatever that might look like for you.
And it might include martyrdom. But then Jesus, after he talks about his upcoming suffering, he says, this whole business of positions of authority in my kingdom, I'm not really into that. God rewards us, but I'm not handing out those kinds of perks. But by the time he said that, the disciples who had gotten wind of this request, the other 10, are furious. Not because they're more high-minded and noble than James and John, who I'm sure put their mother up to this question, but because they, I'm sure, have thought the same things. What are we getting out of following you all the way here to Jerusalem? And so Jesus uses this opportunity of their clamoring for authority to say, you guys just don't know what you're talking about. My kingdom is simply not about authority. And this is an important point in Matthew that we've seen kind of creeping up on us, but it's going to become very clear by the time we get to the very end of Matthew's gospel, where the last words he says is, all authority in heaven and on earth is mine. It's not yours. He's talking to the disciples when he says that. He says,
I never thought of it through that lens of this passage specifically.
It's not about, this is not about your authority. This is about my authority. Forget your authority. And Jesus has already been trying to teach them that as early as this moment right here, where he says, you know what? This clamoring for authority is a worldly thing. It's an earthly thing. In fact, it's a pagan thing. And how do we know that? Look at what he says in 25. You know, it's the rulers of the Gentiles who want to lord it over other people. It's their great ones who want to be tyrants over others. And then the words of verse 26 just give me the chills. It will not be so with you. In other words, being part of my kingdom is simply not about human authority. And I think the church needs to continue to take that very seriously, because I don't know about you or anybody else who's joining us today, but I am tempted by the world around me to want to have authority. And as part of the church, I think sometimes, boy, I wish the church just had more economic clout or more political sway, or like that. I've kind of bought into thinking that gaining political power or economic influence, gaining authority, is the way in which for the church to thrive and for the kingdom to come. And Jesus couldn't say it more clearly.
It's different.
It just isn't what we're about. And so I think we need, as the church and as individual believers, to take that very, very seriously. And it kind of brings us back to the frame, doesn't it?
To what we've been looking at all along, that it says the first shall be last and the last shall be first. I actually came across, I'll say this quickly, but in one of my readings on this chapter, it was saying how, it does feel like it's so tempting to just want power. You're right, even in churches, Christians, that we kind of forget this mentality, this passage, and we think that we're supposed to have power. We almost trick ourselves into thinking it's a good thing. Oh, I'll get power for the sake of Christ. And this author was talking about how, all along, we're actually meant to give power away. Anyone who wishes to be first among you must be your slave. And he said, this author was writing, if you're a slave, all you're doing is giving power away, which in a sense means you have nothing to lose, that you're just always serving others. And that's the way that the kingdom of God works. And that just really stuck with me, that it's never about even seeking after that in the slightest, that the first shall be last and the last shall be first.
And even Jesus, who, as I just pointed out in the last verses of this gospel, reminds them that he has all authority, says, but I don't exercise that authority the way the culture does.
It's different. Jesus' kingdom looks so different.
Because in verse 28, he says, just as the Son of Man, there he's talking about himself, came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus says it all actually starts with me. The kind of authority I bear is the authority of a life yielded up to the will of God in the service of others. And if you're going to be my followers, then that's
the
what
same
you
thing.
got.
Yeah. If that's how the one we follow lives and serves, yeah, how much
Yeah.
more would we serve that way? That's
Yep.
great.
So,
Wow. That's a
important.
hard teaching. All of this is
Hard
so
and
far,
important.
yeah,
Yep.
for us to remember.
Good.
Then we go ahead on to the last section of this chapter. It's verses 29 through 34. They're leaving Jericho, so this is their last stop before Jerusalem. And we see some blind men in this story. So a lot of different things here. Once again, we see that in a sense they're treated as an unwelcome interruption. The crowd is ordering them to be quiet. They're sending them away, and they just keep yelling after Jesus. So lots of different things that we can notice here. Where do you want to start as we take a look at this together?
Well, let's start with the blind men themselves. I like what they say about Jesus and to Jesus. Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. And they say it twice, louder the second time. And what that tells us is that they believe he is the Lord. I don't know how much they understood, but that's the right title. And they believe that he is the source of God's mercy for them. That's true. And they call him Son of David, which is like a way of saying, we believe that you're the Messiah that God has promised and you've come. So these guys say the right things, and they do the right thing by coming to Jesus and not letting the crowds block their encounter with Jesus. The other thing that this little story impresses on me is the way Jesus responds to them. Jesus doesn't ignore them. He doesn't follow the leading of the crowd to say, hush, get over there. We're thinking big thoughts with Jesus over here. Jesus said, come here. What do you want me to do for you? And there's that
question again
Yeah.
that he asked in the last passage. He asked their mother, what do you want? And once again, what do you want me to do for you?
Yeah.
I love that, how you said it's Jesus kind of makes them articulate clearly what they're hoping for. And that just says so much about their motivations, but it also says something about what they think Jesus is able to even do for them.
Yeah. And so they clarify in verse 33, Lord, let our eyes be open. And then Jesus' next response is the beautiful one, verse 34. He was moved with compassion. The word compassion is the ugliest beautiful word in the Greek language.
Okay.
Is that
Yes, tell me what that
contradiction?
means. I don't know what you mean.
It's the word for intestines.
Oh, okay.
Guts.
Is that the splog?
Splunk?
Something?
Nah,
Yeah.
good for you.
It does sound ugly.
Oh,
Like, blah.
the Greek is coming back.
It's coming back, yeah.
Janet. Oh, well done. Splunk. Nice. Isn't that an
That
ugly
doesn't sound
word?
like splat.
Yeah. It's
your
just
guts.
the ugliest Greek word to say, to hear. Splankna. And its meaning is kind of ugly. Guts, intestines. But they used it to mean compassion, because you do kind of feel things in the gut, right? You get butterflies in your stomach, not in your head,
Yeah.
right? This is where you feel things. And so Jesus was moved with deep feeling for the plight of these blind men and what it meant for their lives and the way other people reacted to them. And so he not only thought good thoughts, compassionate thoughts, he touched them and he healed them. And immediately when they regained their sight, they followed him. That reminds me of the story of Peter's mother-in-law. Remember, who had the high fever?
Yes,
And he healed her, and it says she got up and served them. She had the instinct of a disciple who immediately set about the task of serving the needs of Jesus and his followers. These guys also have the instinct of a disciple who, as soon as they can see to follow, do so.
Yeah, they have an immediate response and reaction.
yeah.
They don't just go on their merry little way somewhere. Yeah.
So I love the way this story ends with compassion and following.
Yeah. So we learn a lot from that, and a lot from this chapter in general. So much of this is from that framework: the last shall be first, the first shall be last. That we see the dead shall be raised, so that Jesus' prediction is in there. What else are you seeing throughout this chapter as we look at some of the themes of it?
Yeah, the blind will see, and that we all must follow. Jesus is the one that is the model for all of it. He's the one who came to serve, not to be served. He came as a rescue, a ransom for many. He came full of compassion. He came as the Son of David, the Messiah, on his terms, not on our terms. And he is the one who ultimately must be followed.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I love just hearing that list of things. It's all kind of this framework that's flipped upside down. And something you'll hear a lot about as you look at the teachings of Jesus is that it's an upside down kingdom, or you could say it's a right side up kingdom. That's the way it was always meant to be, that the last shall be first, the dead shall be raised, that the blind will see, and that with that we follow Jesus. So I hope that this week you can let that resonate with you a little bit. Sit with that of how are you living that out? Are you living as someone who the first shall be first and you're seeking authority, you're seeking to be first and in charge of everything, you're seeking maybe attention and power in different ways? Or are we following Jesus, knowing that Jesus is the one we yield our lives to, and we yield our lives to a yielded servant? That's the kind of God we serve. We serve someone who came before us and served. So how much more are we supposed to serve? I hope you'll sit with that this week as we continue to challenge ourselves with the teachings of Jesus.